Jack Carter stood at the gate of Hollow Creek Cemetery, flashlight in hand, scanning the dimly lit path that wound through the rows of weathered tombstones. The faint rustle of the wind through the trees was the only sound that broke the silence of the night. It was always quiet here, especially at this hour, midnight, when most of the town was asleep. Jack had been on the night shift at the cemetery for nearly 5 years now, and his routine was as predictable as the rising moon. For Jack, this was just another job. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The paycheck came like clockwork, direct deposit every 2 weeks. Same amount, same account. He hadn't really thought much about it. Working here paid the bills and kept food on the table. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. That was all that mattered. Hollow Creek was a small town tucked away from the bustle of the city. It had one main street, a couple of family-owned diners, and a handful of shops that closed early every night. The cemetery sat on the outskirts of town, tucked away behind a row of old oaks that had seen generations come and go. It was a historic place, founded in the mid-1800s, and although Jack had worked here long enough to know its every corner, it never really felt special to him. To him, it was just a cemetery, old, quiet, and forgotten. Jack's life had always been simple. Born and raised in Hollow Creek, he'd never strayed too far from the familiar streets. His father was a mechanic, and his mother worked part-time at the local grocery store. Neither of them had ever pushed him to aim for anything more than what was in front of him. When Jack dropped out of high school in his junior year, no one seemed particularly surprised. He'd always been a quiet kid, not one for books or classrooms. After a brief stint working in construction, he'd taken on this job as a night guard, and it stuck. There wasn't much else for someone like him. His duties were simple. Jack had to patrol the grounds, make sure no one tried to vandalize the gravestones, and ensure that no one was trespassing after hours. He'd make his rounds every hour, walking past the iron gates, through the overgrown sections of the cemetery, checking the locks on the older mausoleums. It was the same every night, and honestly, Jack didn't mind. It was peaceful. A break from the world that seemed too fast and too noisy for him, but peace had its price. The cemetery, with its endless rows of headstones, always felt like it was watching him. It wasn't something you could put into words. It was more of a feeling that settled deep in his gut. Hollow Creek Cemetery wasn't just old, it was ancient. And while Jack had worked here for years, there were always parts of the cemetery that felt unfamiliar, unwelcoming, like the land itself had secrets it was unwilling to share. Every now and then, Jack would hear strange sounds, whispers that he couldn't place. It could have been the wind or perhaps an animal scurrying through the grass, but there were nights when he would swear that something was watching him. He chalked it up to fatigue or the overactive imagination of a man who had spent too many nights alone in the dark, but every so often, the feeling would make his skin prickle. Tonight was no different. Jack made his way toward the farthest corner of the cemetery, where the oldest graves were located, walking past the crumbling tombs that had been there long before he was born. His flashlight flickered briefly, casting long shadows against the weathered stone. The air was crisp, and the scent of damp earth filled his nostrils. It was a peaceful night, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Something was off. He pushed the thought aside as he reached the Wainwright Crypt, the oldest and most well-known monument in the cemetery. The crypt stood at the top of a hill, towering over the other graves, its stone facade dark and imposing. The iron gates of the crypt were locked tight, as they always were. Jack had been told many times over the years to make sure the crypt was never tampered with, but that was the extent of his knowledge. He didn't know why the Wainwright family's final resting place was so important. He didn't care to know. It was just part of the job. As Jack leaned against the stone wall of the crypt, adjusting his flashlight, he noticed something strange. The lock on the gate seemed newer. The brass was shining, almost freshly polished. He hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed almost out of place. Jack frowned and glanced around, but no one was there. The cemetery was empty as usual. Shaking his head, he turned away and began walking back toward the entrance of the cemetery, dismissing the thought. After all, it was just a lock, just another part of the job. But as Jack made his way down the path, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the lock or the unusual silence. It was a deeper sense, like an old, unseen hand was reaching out from the past, brushing against him. He had always ignored it before, but tonight, that feeling seemed stronger. It felt as if the cemetery itself was waiting for something, for someone. Jack's footsteps echoed as he continued his rounds, his mind returning to the mundane tasks of the night. He was the night guard, just another small-town job that paid the bills. But somewhere deep down, Jack knew that tonight wouldn't be like every other night. The feeling in the air had changed, and he couldn't shake the sense that something was about to happen. He just didn't know what. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees, and for the briefest moment, Jack thought he heard something else, something distant, on the wind. It wasn't a whisper. It was a voice, soft, faint, but unmistakably there. He paused, heart racing. But when he looked around, there was nothing. Just the quiet, empty cemetery. "Get a grip, Jack," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. It was just his imagination. The cemetery had a way of playing tricks on people. Nothing more. He pressed on, the night stretching out before him like any other. Yet deep down, Jack knew this night would be different. He just didn't know how or why. Jack sat in the security booth, a dim light casting long shadows across the small room. The hum of the old heater filled the silence as he leaned back in his chair, his feet propped up on the desk. The night was as still as ever, the soft rustling of leaves in the cemetery the only sound in the air. He just finished his rounds and had a few hours before it was time to check again. Everything was as it should be, calm and uneventful. The only thing that marred the monotony was the persistent feeling that tonight felt different. Jack couldn't put his finger on it, but something about the air, something about the cemetery made him uneasy. He tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the weather, or maybe it was the fact that it had been an unusually quiet week. He had been alone at the cemetery every night for years, and never once had anything unusual happened. It was just a job. The old telephone on the desk rang sharply, breaking the silence like a gunshot in the dark. Jack jumped slightly, startled by the sudden noise, though he had been expecting the call. The phone never rang unless it was the Wainwrights' representative, Mrs. Evelyn Wainwright. She was the last living member of the Wainwright family, the ones whose crypt he had been tasked with guarding. It was rare for her to contact him, but every few months she'd check in. Usually, it was just to remind him of the same instructions. Guard the crypt, don't let anyone near it. Jack reached over, picking up the receiver with a groan. He had just settled into his chair, and the last thing he needed was another one of Mrs. Wainwright's routine check-ins. She was a reserved, elderly woman, but she always had a certain sense of authority in her voice. "Mr. Carter," her voice crackled through the line, a bit more strained than usual. "I need you to listen carefully. Jack blinked, his curiosity piqued. This didn't sound like the usual call. "Mrs. Wainwright, everything all right?" He set the receiver against his ear, leaning forward, trying to pick up any clue in her voice. There was something odd in her tone, something urgent. "Tonight's the night," she said, her words deliberate, almost as if she were trying to make them crystal clear. "The Wainwright crypt must be opened." Jack froze. The Wainwright crypt opened. That was impossible. The crypt had been locked for as long as he had worked here. It had been sealed for a reason, and that reason was never explained. His instructions had always been clear: do not let anyone near it under any circumstances. "Wait a minute, Mrs. Wainwright," Jack said, his voice thick with confusion. I don't understand. The crypt is sealed. Why would anyone open it now?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The air in the booth seemed to grow heavier, the quiet tension in the words almost palpable. "You mustn't ask too many questions, Mr. Carter," she replied, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Just know this: there are people who will try to open it tonight, and you must stop them." Jack leaned back in his chair, his hand tightening around the receiver. He could hear the sound of papers rustling in the background, an indication that Mrs. Wainwright was probably preparing something, or maybe she was just anxious. He knew her family had been wealthy and powerful at one time, but the Wainwrights had been a long-forgotten name in the town. It didn't make sense. "But Mrs. Wainwright, what's inside the crypt? Why do people want to open it now?" Jack pressed, his voice faltering. "You've never told me why we guard it so closely." There was a long silence before she spoke again, her voice now tinged with something akin to fear. "Some things are better left unknown, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "But tonight it is not about what's inside, it's about what might come out. You don't need to know everything, but you do need to protect it. Do not let anyone near the Wainwright crypt, no matter what." Her voice grew firmer, as if she were giving an order. "You must be vigilant. I am counting on you." Jack opened his mouth to speak again, but she hung up before he could say anything more. He sat there in the silence that followed, staring at the phone in his hand, his mind racing. What did she mean? What might come out? The crypt wasn't supposed to be opened. He had seen the lock, the heavy iron gates, rusted with age but still strong. The crypt was sealed with some kind of ancient seal that no one had ever been able to break. Why would someone want to open it now? And why, after all these years, was she contacting him now, giving him this strange, urgent task? Jack's heart was racing. The unease he had felt earlier was now a tangible, gnawing fear deep in his gut. He had always trusted his instincts, but this was something different. This wasn't just another routine night at the cemetery. There was something more at play here, something dark and mysterious. And yet, despite his rising anxiety, there was also a deep sense of responsibility. It wasn't just the crypt he had to guard. It was the people who had paid him to do this job, even though they had never told him exactly why. Mrs. Wainwright had trusted him to keep the crypt safe for years, and now it seemed like her trust had led him into something much deeper than he had ever imagined. Jack took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. His duty was clear: protect the crypt at all costs. He had been told to guard it, and that's what he would do. But something told him that tonight, guarding the Wainwright crypt would be far more than just locking gates and walking patrols. Tonight, he would face something he hadn't prepared for, something that had been waiting for this very moment. Grabbing his flashlight, Jack stood up and walked to the door of the security booth. The cemetery was still, bathed in the eerie glow of the moonlight. The air felt thick, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone anymore. As he stepped outside, the wind picked up, swirling around him. It seemed colder than it should be for this time of year, and the shadows cast by the tall tombstones seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as if they were reaching out to grab him. He turned his flashlight on and made his way toward the Wainwright crypt, the sense of unease growing with every step. The phone call was still ringing in his ears. "You must be vigilant, Mrs." Wainwright's words echoed in his mind. Jack glanced over his shoulder, almost expecting someone or something to be watching him. The cemetery, with its centuries-old history, felt alive with whispers and secrets, and for the first time since he had started working here, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that those secrets were beginning to reveal themselves. Jack's flashlight cut through the darkness, casting a beam of pale yellow light on the overgrown path ahead. The cemetery, despite its solemn and peaceful nature, had always carried a certain heaviness in the air, but tonight the weight of it was unbearable. His footsteps echoed in the silence as he moved toward the Wainwright crypt, the place that had haunted his thoughts since Mrs. Wainwright's call. As he approached, the crypt slowly emerged from the shadows, and Jack couldn't help but stop for a moment to take it all in. He had walked past this crypt countless times during his shifts, but tonight, under the moonlight, it seemed different, more imposing, more alive. The ancient stonework glistened under the faint light, its surface darkened by centuries of weather and age. The crypt stood on a raised platform, surrounded by a wrought iron fence that looked as though it had been crafted in a time long forgotten. The iron gates that sealed it off were old and heavy, but Jack had never been able to get a clear look at them before tonight. Now, standing in front of it, he could see the fine details. The intricate engravings on the gate's surface, the faded symbols carved into the stone, the deep grooves in the iron, as though the metal itself had been scarred by something otherworldly. The moonlight hit the crypt's stone facade at an angle, making the carvings on the stone appear almost alive, shifting in the dim light. Jack took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding. There was something unsettling about it, like the crypt itself was watching him, waiting for him to do something, or not do something. Jack could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. This wasn't just any crypt, it was the Wainwright crypt. The Wainwright family had built this mausoleum with an imposing sense of grandeur that could be seen in the very architecture itself. As Jack stood there, examining the structure, he could almost hear the whispers of history, the echoes of a family long gone, now only remembered in the shadows of their legacy. He stepped closer, his footfalls quiet on the gravel path. He'd heard stories about the Wainwrights growing up. They were a powerful family in Hollow Creek, once the most influential and wealthy in town. Their wealth had been built on land, trade, and secret dealings, but as the years passed, their name became associated with strange rumors and whispers. People in town would talk about the Wainwrights with a sense of fear, a quiet respect mixed with wariness. There were stories of rituals, of strange practices, and of a family that had grown so reclusive that even their wealth couldn't shield them from the growing suspicion. Jack had always brushed off these stories as just that, stories. People loved to gossip, especially about the rich and powerful. But tonight, as he stood before the crypt, those stories began to feel more like warnings. He could almost hear the faint whispers of the past, like a secret that had been buried long ago and was now rising to the surface. As Jack leaned closer to the gate, his flashlight flickered. He cursed under his breath and gave it a quick shake. The beam steadied, and he continued his inspection. The lock, which had seemed so ordinary before, now appeared far more intricate. The metal was smoother than it had any right to be, considering the state of the crypt. It almost looked new, freshly oiled, carefully maintained. Jack couldn't help but wonder who had been maintaining this crypt for all these years. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of something distant, almost like a low murmur carried on the wind. He looked around, but the cemetery was still as ever, the tombstones standing like silent sentinels. He swallowed hard, telling himself it was just his imagination. He turned his attention back to the crypt, his curiosity now stronger than his unease. As Jack studied the crypt, his mind wandered to the history of the Wainwright family, a history that had always been shrouded in mystery. The Wainwrights were not always as isolated as they were now. In the early days, they were pillars of the community, business owners, landholders, and town benefactors. They were the kind of family people respected, even feared. But as time wore on, the Wainwrights began to withdraw from society. They were never seen in public, their grand estate on the outskirts of town abandoned, and the once vibrant family gatherings ceased. Rumors began to spread. Some said they had turned to darker practices in search of immortality. Others claimed they were hiding away from a family curse. But the most persistent rumor, the one that had haunted Hollow Creek for generations, was that the Wainwrights had discovered something that should have been left alone, something that lived beyond the veil of life and death. Jack had heard the story from his grandmother, a woman who was born and raised in Hollow Creek. She told him about the strange rituals the Wainwrights were rumored to perform in the dead of night. She said they believed in an ancient power, something older than time itself, and that the crypt was built to contain whatever it was that they had discovered. It was the crypt's true purpose, his grandmother had said, to keep the creature at bay. The Wainwrights sealed it in, and they paid a price for it. Jack had never believed her. To him, it had all sounded like superstitious nonsense. But now, standing before the crypt, he wondered, was there some truth to it after all? Jack continued to inspect the lock on the crypt's gates, but the more he looked at it, the more he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. This was no ordinary lock. It was a symbol of something far more dangerous, something that had been hidden away, carefully sealed off from the world. As his flashlight flickered again, Jack finally dared to touch the iron gate, his fingers brushing lightly over the cool metal. For a moment, he thought he heard a soft, distant sound, the faintest scratching like nails dragging across stone. He jerked his hand back, heart pounding. The cemetery around him seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with a sense of anticipation. But no, he told himself. It was nothing, just the wind, or maybe an animal, perhaps a raccoon or a fox. There was no reason to be afraid. Still, as he stepped back from the crypt, a sinking feeling washed over him. He had worked in this cemetery for years, yet he'd never fully understood why the Wainwright crypt was so important. He had never thought to ask. It was just part of the job, part of the routine. But now, with Mrs. Wainwright's words echoing in his mind, the crypt was no longer just a tomb, it was a prison. And whatever was sealed inside, whatever had been locked away for so many years, was something Jack wasn't sure he wanted to know. The night air was cooler than usual, a sharp breeze cutting through the cemetery's winding paths. Jack's flashlight cast long, trembling shadows as he made his rounds, his boots crunching against the gravel with each step. The Wainwright crypt loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette still holding a strange weight in Jack's mind. The unsettling feeling he had been carrying all night seemed to grow heavier as he approached the mausoleum, its iron gates reflecting the faint light from the moon above. For the past week, something had been nagging at Jack, a presence he couldn't quite place. Every night as he walked his patrols, there was a figure near the crypt. At first, Jack had chalked it up to his overactive imagination, but by now he couldn't deny that something was off. The figure was always there, standing motionless by the crypt as though waiting for something. The man never moved, never spoke. It was as if he was a fixture of the night, blending into the cemetery's shadows. Tonight, however, Jack couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease in his gut. He had just passed the crypt's iron gates when he saw the figure again, standing tall, his back straight, and his face hidden under the brim of a dark hat. The man wore a long coat, even though the weather was mild. His silhouette was too familiar now. Jack could almost recognize him from the distant nights when he'd seen him from afar. Without thinking, Jack moved closer, his steps measured and deliberate. His flashlight illuminated the figure, but the man didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge Jack's presence. He simply stood there, staring ahead, his hands clasped behind his back. Jack stopped a few paces away, his heart beating faster. "Hey," he called out, his voice breaking the eerie silence. "What are you doing here?" The man turned slowly, and for a moment Jack could see his face. A sharp, angular jawline, pale skin, and eyes that seemed too intense, too focused. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at Jack, as though he could see right through him. The man didn't answer immediately, his eyes lingering for a beat too long, and Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice smooth and calm, almost too calm. "I didn't mean to startle you. I'm just looking around." Jack frowned, instinctively gripping his flashlight tighter. "Looking around. This is private property, and you're not supposed to be here after hours." The man nodded slowly, as if considering his response. "I know, I'm not trespassing though, just doing some research." Jack's curiosity flared. "Research on what?" The man's gaze flickered briefly to the crypt, then back to Jack. "The cemetery's history, it's fascinating, don't you think? The Wainwright family, the crypt, it has such a rich, complex past. You wouldn't believe the things I've uncovered." Jack's pulse quickened. He hadn't known much about the Wainwright family, just the whispers and rumors that had floated around Hollow Creek for years. He had heard the stories, sure, but he never thought much of them. It was just an old family with too many secrets. But now, with the man standing there in the shadows, talking so casually about the Wainwrights, Jack's sense of unease deepened. This was more than just a historian. There was something about him that felt off, something untrustworthy. "You're a historian?" Jack asked, narrowing his eyes. "For who? Why are you here at night? And why the Wainwright crypt? It's not like the rest of the cemetery." The man's lips curled into a small, knowing smile, and for a split second Jack saw something unsettling in his expression, something that made his stomach tighten. "I have a particular interest in the Wainwrights. My research has led me here to the crypt. There are things hidden within this place, things that could change everything." Jack felt the hairs on his neck stand up, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "Things? What kind of things? This crypt is off limits. No one is supposed to open it." The man took a step forward, his coat fluttering behind him like a dark shadow. "Exactly," he said softly. "That's why I'm here, to make sure it stays closed. The crypt is part of something much bigger than most people realize. It's not just a tomb, it's a prison. And I'm here to make sure it stays that way." Jack took a half step back, his mind racing. "Prison? What are you talking about?" The man's eyes glinted in the low light, a strange intensity radiating from him. The Wainwright family wasn't just protecting their dead. They were guarding something that shouldn't be unleashed. This place, this crypt, was built to keep it locked away, and now someone is trying to break the seal. Jack's breath caught in his throat. What seal? What are you saying? The stranger seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. I can't say too much. It's not my place. But I'm sure you've noticed strange things happening here. The crypt, it's never been just a tomb. It's a doorway to something ancient, and whoever is trying to open it has no idea what they are dealing with. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. His mind was swimming with 1,000 questions, but one thing stood out. This man knew more about the crypt than he was letting on. And somehow, Jack felt like he was being drawn into something much bigger than a simple job. "Who are you really?" Jack asked, trying to steady his voice. The man smiled again, that unsettling grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Someone who knows more than he should, I suppose. Someone who has been looking for the truth for a long time. But don't worry, Mr. Carter, I'm here to help you. We're on the same side." Jack shook his head, still unsure of what to make of him. The more the man spoke, the more Jack felt like he was being lured into a trap. This didn't feel like a historian. It felt like a man with a hidden agenda, someone who had an obsession with the Wainwright crypt and whatever secret it held. "I'm just doing my job," Jack said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "If you're really researching, you need to leave now." The stranger's smile faded, but his gaze remained sharp. "Very well," he said, his voice still calm. "But remember this, Mr. Carter. You can't stop what's already set in motion. You're just guarding the gates. You won't be able to stop them forever." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night as silently as he had come. Jack stood there for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. His heart was still pounding, and the questions raced through his mind. Who was that man? And what did he know about the crypt that Jack didn't? As the man's figure disappeared into the shadows, Jack felt a strange sense of dread settle over him. The cemetery, once a place of routine, now felt like a stage for something much darker. Jack's job had always been simple: guard the crypt, keep people out. But tonight, something had changed. The Wainwright crypt wasn't just a tomb, and the stranger who lurked in the night wasn't just a historian. There was something much more dangerous at play here. Jack sat in the security booth, the night stretching out before him like a long, empty road. His shift had started uneventfully, but his mind kept drifting back to the strange figure near the Wainwright crypt and the unsettling conversation they had shared. His usual routine of walking the cemetery grounds felt strangely hollow, the quiet evening pierced only by the sound of his boots on gravel. But tonight, as Jack reached into the back of the booth to retrieve the standard paperwork, something caught his eye: a thick, yellowed envelope tucked beneath a pile of old forms. It had no return address, just his name written in elegant script on the front. Jack furrowed his brow. The letter was heavy, almost as though it contained something more than just paper. He tore it open carefully, half expecting it to be another one of Mrs. Wainwright's routine instructions or an update on the crypt. What he found inside was far more than he anticipated. A set of journals, each one bound in dark leather with faded gold lettering. They were worn from age, their edges frayed and curling at the corners, but they still exuded an air of authority, as though they had been preserved for a purpose. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the first journal. The name on the cover read, Jeremiah Wainwright. His mind raced. Jeremiah Wainwright, Mrs. Wainwright's great-grandfather, the man who had built the crypt. Jack knew only the barest details about him. The town's history had painted him as a doctor, a well-respected member of the community, but nothing beyond that. There had always been vague rumors of eccentricity, of odd behaviors, but nothing concrete. Now, it seemed, Jack was about to discover more than he ever imagined. He opened the first journal and began to read. The pages were filled with scrawled handwriting, sometimes erratic, sometimes smooth and composed, reflecting the gradual unraveling of the mind behind them. Jeremiah Wainwright's early entries spoke of his work as a doctor in Hollow Creek, his detailed notes on patient treatments, and his increasing interest in the dying process. But as Jack flipped through the pages, something darker began to emerge. The tone shifted from scientific observation to something far more unsettling. "The dead speak to me now," one entry read, "but they speak in riddles, in symbols I cannot yet understand. They whisper of places beyond the veil of life, where time does not exist. I must learn more." Jack's pulse quickened as he read. His mind raced to make sense of the cryptic words. What was Jeremiah talking about? The phrase "beyond the veil of life" sent a chill down his spine. Was this simply the ramblings of an aging man or something more? As Jack read further, the nature of Jeremiah's discovery became clearer, though far more disturbing. "I've discovered that the dying process is not an end, but a beginning. The soul, as it leaves the body, passes through a space where it is no longer bound by the rules of life, but something feeds on it, something ancient. I must protect my family from it. I must trap it." The handwriting grew shakier, and Jack could feel his heart race with every sentence he read. The next entry, dated several years later, painted an even more terrifying picture. "I've learned more about what waits in the shadows beyond death. It is not a god, nor is it a devil. It is an entity that feeds on dying souls, devouring them in the final moments of life. It is ancient, older than humanity itself. The Wainwright family has been chosen to guard against it, to trap it in this crypt. We are the keepers, the protectors, and if the trap is broken, it will be free. It will feed, and all will be lost." Jack's breath caught in his throat. "It feeds on dying souls." The words repeated in his mind like a drumbeat. He had heard stories, of course, stories about the Wainwright family and their odd ways, but never anything like this. Never anything so real. He quickly flipped through the pages, his hands trembling as he reached for the next entry. The next few pages detailed something even darker. Jeremiah wrote of a ritual, a series of steps the Wainwright family had performed in an attempt to trap the entity. He described the crypt's construction in chilling detail: the iron gates, the stone walls, and the symbols carved into the very foundation. It wasn't just a tomb, Jack realized. The crypt was a prison built with blood, sweat, and the full knowledge of what they were locking away. "We have done what we must," one entry read. "The ritual requires sacrifice. The bloodline must be preserved to ensure the trap's strength. The last member of the family will be the final sacrifice. Only then will the seal be complete, and the creature will be bound for eternity. If I do not finish the work, my family will be doomed. We will all become its prey." Jack's mind reeled as he read the words. A family sacrifice. The last member of the Wainwright line would be the one to finish the ritual. Was this why Mrs. Wainwright had contacted him? Was this why the crypt had always been guarded so vigilantly? Jack had thought his job was just to patrol, to keep people away from the crypt, but now it seemed much more significant. His job was more than just guarding a cemetery. It was guarding the only thing standing between an ancient, malevolent force and the rest of the world. Jack could feel his stomach twist as he turned the pages, reading more about the trap and its purpose. The crypt wasn't just a place of rest. It was a prison for something far worse than death. The Wainwright family had chosen to protect it, but at a cost. Over the years, they had used their own blood to maintain the seal. They had willingly sacrificed their own lives to keep the entity contained. Jeremiah's last journal entries were filled with desperation. "I am the last of the Wainwrights," he wrote, "and if I do not succeed, the trap will fail. I must make my family pay the ultimate price. My wife, my children, none of them will be spared. We are the keepers of this secret and we are bound to it. But if we fail, we will all fall to it and the world will suffer." Jack's heart raced as he closed the journal. He had read enough. The Wainwright family had been guarding the crypt for generations, not just to protect their own dead, but to imprison something far more dangerous. The crypt was never meant to be a tomb. It was a seal, a trap designed to keep an ancient creature from feeding on the souls of the dying. Jack leaned back in his chair, the weight of the journals heavy in his hands. He had always thought of his job as a mundane, straightforward task: guard the crypt, make sure no one disturbed it, and go home. But now, everything had changed. He wasn't just protecting a family's legacy. He was protecting the world from something far worse than death itself. The crypt was a prison. The creature it contained was real and it fed on the dying. It had been trapped by the Wainwright family, using their own blood and sacrifice to keep it contained. And Jack was part of that legacy now. He had been chosen, whether he liked it or not, to continue their work. He was the guardian, the last line of defense against an entity that could destroy everything. Jack stood up, his mind spinning with the weight of the revelation. He had always thought of his job as just that, a job. But now he realized that it was far more than that. It wasn't just about the crypt. It was about keeping the world safe, keeping the creature locked away, and making sure that the horrors within the crypt never escaped. Jack could no longer ignore the truth. His job was to guard the gates of hell itself. The wind howled through Hollow Creek Cemetery, a sharp, biting breeze that seemed to carry with it a sense of urgency. Jack had just finished his second patrol of the night, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but the strange feeling that had clung to him all week refused to let go. The air felt thick tonight, as though something was waiting just beneath the surface, something ready to break through. He had noticed it for days now, the unease. It wasn't just the crypt or the strange man who appeared near it. It was everything. The shadows seemed deeper, the wind more constant, and the cemetery more alive with an energy that unsettled him. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the feeling had only intensified since the night he'd spoken to the stranger. The crypt, now more than just a building, felt like a ticking time bomb. Jack made his way back toward the Wainwright crypt, the centerpiece of his unease. The iron gates gleamed faintly in the moonlight, but something was different tonight. The closer he got, the more his instincts screamed at him to stop, to turn around, but he couldn't. He had to check. As he approached the gates, Jack's breath caught in his throat. The lock, it was different. Before, the lock had been old, rusted with age, its brass tarnished from years of exposure to the elements. But tonight it stood out as unnaturally new, its surface smooth and gleaming under the pale light. It wasn't just polished, it looked freshly made, as if someone had replaced the old lock with this one only hours before. Jack's mind raced. He hadn't heard any noise, hadn't seen anyone come or go. He was alone on the grounds. Who could have done this? His fingers tingled with a growing sense of dread. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been tampering with the crypt. The gate was still shut tight, but the lock was a glaring warning. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the cold metal, running his fingers over its surface. It was smooth, untouched by the weather or the years of neglect. This lock, Jack realized, wasn't part of the crypt's history. It was something new, something meant to replace the old, something that had been placed there with purpose. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the cemetery, the leaves rustling like whispers in the trees. Jack pulled his hand away from the lock, his heart racing. He looked around, expecting to see something, anything, that could explain the sudden change, but there was nothing. Only the dead silence of the graveyard stretching out before him in all directions. He swallowed hard. The air around the crypt seemed heavier now, like the pressure had increased in a way he couldn't explain. He had to be imagining things. He had to be. But the feeling was undeniable. Then, as if to further confirm his growing paranoia, something caught his eye, a faint mark on the stone wall near the crypt's entrance. He hadn't seen it before, and it was so faint that it might have easily been overlooked. But now, standing there with the new lock in his hand, it seemed as though it was staring back at him. It wasn't just a mark, it was a symbol. He walked closer, his flashlight illuminating the engraving. The symbol was intricate, a series of curved lines that spiraled into a central point, like some ancient sigil carved into the stone. Jack's pulse quickened as he traced the lines with his eyes. He had seen something similar in the journals, but this was different. This symbol was a warning. The hairs on his neck prickled as he realized it was the same symbol he had seen in the Wainwright journals. The symbols Jeremiah had described in his writings, the ones that were part of the ritual. These were not just markings, they were seals, symbols meant to contain something. Jack stepped back, his mind spinning. Had someone else found these symbols too? Was this part of the tampering? Was someone trying to break the seal? A cold chill swept over him as he realized the full weight of what he was standing before. This wasn't just about guarding the crypt anymore. Someone was actively trying to break into it. Someone knew the crypt's secret. They knew what it contained. They were trying to unlock it. Before Jack could think any further, another gust of wind hit, swirling the leaves around him like a vortex. The whispering sound in the wind was back, louder this time, as if it were calling to him. Jack spun around, his flashlight shaking in his hands. Shadows danced at the edge of his vision, twisting and stretching unnaturally, moving without any clear source. He felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It was as if the shadows themselves had eyes. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. But there was no answer, only the rustling of the leaves in the trees and the soft scrape of the wind. Jack's breath caught as he noticed something else, a figure standing at the far end of the cemetery just beyond the old oak tree. It was a silhouette, tall and unmoving, as if it had been waiting for him. The figure was shrouded in darkness, its outline obscured, but there was something undeniably unsettling about it. His heart pounded in his chest as the figure didn't move. It simply stood there watching him. Jack squinted, trying to make out more details. Was it a person? A trick of the light? He took a step forward, but the figure remained unmoved, the shadows around it thickening. Suddenly it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. Jack froze, staring at the spot where the figure had stood just moments ago. The wind stopped, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. His chest tightened and his breath came out in shallow bursts. His mind raced, questioning what he had just seen. A person, a shadow. Had it all been in his head? The whispering wind returned, but this time it wasn't in the trees. It was coming from the crypt, coming from behind the stone walls. Jack could feel it, the presence. Something was there, something was waiting, something was trying to get out. He backed away from the crypt, his instincts telling him to run, to leave this place before whatever it was had the chance to break free. His hands were clammy, his chest tight with fear, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the crypt. The symbols, the new lock, the figure, the whispers. He had been guarding this place for years, but now he realized something far more sinister was at play. The crypt wasn't just a place to keep the dead, it was a prison for something alive, something ancient and dangerous, and someone was trying to open it. Someone had already started tampering with the seal. Jack stumbled backward, his thoughts a whirlwind. He had to stop them. He had to stop whatever was coming. But how? What could he do against something that had been trapped for so long? How could he possibly contain it? His only answer was the crypt, a prison that was slowly but surely being unlocked. The wind howled through Hollow Creek Cemetery as Jack stood at the gates of the Wainwright crypt, his heart racing in his chest. His mind was still reeling from the strange events of the night, what he had seen, what he had felt. The new lock, the symbols, the shadowy figure, the whispers. Something was happening, and it was happening fast. He had tried to make sense of it all, but each new discovery only led to more questions. Why had the lock been replaced? Who had been tampering with the crypt? And why did he feel as if time was running out? It wasn't until the sound of tires crunching on the gravel road that Jack looked up, his eyes narrowing as headlights illuminated the foggy night. A car slowly made its way down the long driveway, the soft whine of the engine cutting through the silence. He knew who it was before the car even came to a full stop. Mrs. Evelyn Wainwright. She stepped out of the car with a slow, deliberate motion, her silhouette a sharp contrast against the dim glow of the headlights. She was wearing a dark coat, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, her face pale in the moonlight. The years had caught up to her. Jack could see that, but there was a strength in the way she carried herself, an unspoken command that demanded respect. She didn't say anything as she approached him, but Jack could see it in her eyes. The look of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long and now, at last, had no choice but to share it. "I knew you'd come eventually," Jack said, his voice low, his throat tight. He had seen the change in Mrs. Wainwright after their last phone call, her tone, her urgency. It was clear that something was coming to a head. She nodded grimly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked. "The lock, the symbols, the creature." Jack felt his chest tighten, the weight of her words sinking in. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's happening? What's inside the crypt? What are you guarding?" Mrs. Wainwright took a deep breath, as though steeling herself for what she was about to reveal. "The Wainwright family has been guarding that crypt for generations, Jack. Not just as a family tomb, but as a prison. A prison for something far older and far darker than any of us could have imagined. It's not just a crypt, it's a trap." Jack's mind spun, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place, but still he couldn't quite grasp it. A prison? What's inside? What are you keeping locked away? Mrs. Wainwright's face grew even more somber as she spoke. "A creature. A being that feeds on the transition from life to death. It has been there, trapped in the crypt, for centuries. It is not alive, not dead. It exists in the space between life and death, feeding on the souls of those who are dying. It is ancient and it is powerful, and the Wainwrights have been tasked with keeping it locked away." Jack felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. What is this thing? How is it trapped? Mrs. Wainwright looked toward the crypt, her eyes distant. Our ancestors, Jeremiah Wainwright to be specific, discovered the creature's existence many years ago as part of his medical research. He realized that dying souls are not just drifting into the afterlife. They pass through a space where something hungry waits to devour them. And he found out that it had been feeding on souls for millennia, slowly growing stronger. She paused, her face pale with the weight of what she was about to say. Jeremiah knew that the creature could never be allowed to break free, and so he and the family made a decision to trap it, to keep it locked away in the crypt. But the trap was not just made of stone and iron. It was made with blood, the blood of the Wainwright family. We sealed the creature away by offering our own family members as bait, sacrifices to ensure that it would stay imprisoned. Jack's eyes widened in shock. You used your own family as sacrifices. He repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. Mrs. Wainwright nodded solemnly. Yes, our bloodline was chosen to ensure the creature would stay bound. Each generation, one member of the family would be tasked with ensuring the seal remained unbroken. We gave our lives, our souls, to keep it contained. But now, her voice faltered for a moment, now the last of us is here, and my death will be the final sacrifice. Jack stared at her, struggling to comprehend what she had just said. Your death, Mrs. Wainwright met his gaze, her eyes filled with a deep, unspoken sadness. I am the last of the Wainwright bloodline. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, they all made their sacrifices, but now it is my turn. Once I die, the seal will be broken forever. The creature will be released. Jack's stomach churned as the full weight of her words hit him. And the creature will be free. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, it will feed once more. It will be stronger than ever before, and it will come for everyone. Jack stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. Everything he thought he knew about his job, about the crypt, was wrong. It wasn't just about guarding a family tomb. It was about keeping the world safe from something far worse than death itself. And now, with Mrs. Wainwright's death imminent, the creature would soon be free. But you can't die, Jack said urgently. You can't let this happen. There must be another way. Isn't there something we can do? Mrs. Wainwright shook her head, her expression one of resignation. It's too late. The trap is designed to hold only one last member of the family, the final bloodline. Once that person dies, the creature will break free. There is no stopping it now. Jack stood frozen, feeling the weight of the decision that had been made centuries ago pressing down on him. His job, which had always seemed so simple, was now part of a much larger, much darker story. He wasn't just guarding a crypt. He was guarding the last line of defense against an ancient evil. I'm sorry, Mrs. Wainwright said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of regret and acceptance. But you must understand, this is our curse. The Wainwright family has always known it, and now you do too. My death is the key. When I die, the creature will be free and nothing will be the same again. Jack took a deep breath, his mind racing. This was more than just a job. The fate of the world was resting on his shoulders now, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had been guarding the crypt for years, unaware of the dark truth behind it. But now the secret was out, and Jack knew he had a choice to make. The seal would soon be broken, and there was nothing Jack could do to stop it. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the cemetery as Jack stood beside the Wainwright crypt, his eyes scanning the pages of the journal. Janet, standing beside him, appeared pale and fragile, her one strong posture weakened by the toll her illness had taken. Her once sharp eyes now seemed distant, clouded with the knowledge of her fate, but there was a fire in her voice when she spoke. "Jeremiah's journals have always been the key," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We've always known that the crypt's lock was more than just a physical barrier. It's part of the ritual. The seal is not just held by metal and stone, it's kept in place by the very blood of our family." Jack looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. He had never truly understood the significance of the crypt before, but now, everything seemed to be unfolding like a dark, twisted puzzle. The crypt, the lock, the strange symbols, the creature. It was all tied together by one ancient and terrifying truth. The journal in his hands felt heavier than ever. He flipped through its brittle pages, each one filled with desperate scribblings. Jeremiah Wainwright's handwriting had grown increasingly frantic over the years, his once neat notes degenerating into fevered accounts of ritual and sacrifice. Jack's eyes settled on one particular entry, where the details of the ritual to seal the creature inside were laid out in painstaking detail. "The lock is the key to the creature's prison. It is not merely metal nor stone. It is the vessel that holds the bloodline, the anchor that binds us to the seal. The Wainwrights must give their blood to the crypt, and only with the final sacrifice will the creature be bound forever. Once the last member of the family dies, the seal will be complete, and the creature shall be locked away for eternity. The blood of our line must flow to finish what we began. Only then will the creature never escape." Jack's throat tightened as he read the final words. The last member of the family must die, and Janet was the last of the Wainwrights. Her death was the final piece of the puzzle, the ultimate sacrifice that would trap the creature for all time. "We have to finish this," Jack said quietly, turning to Janet. "We need to prepare for the final ritual. Your death, as horrible as it sounds, is the key. It will trap the creature forever." Janet nodded solemnly, her face an unreadable mask. "I know, Jack. I've known for years what this family has had to do to keep the creature at bay. But now, knowing that my death will complete it, it feels like a betrayal, like I'm leaving everything behind. The burden of this family's curse has fallen to me." She hesitated, looking at the crypt. "But I will do it. I'll make sure the creature is sealed. My death must mean something more than just a sacrifice. It must mean the end." Over the next few days, Jack and Janet worked tirelessly together, deciphering the ritual as described in Jeremiah's journals. The ritual was complex, involving a series of steps that combined symbols, blood, and incantations, all meant to reinforce the seal. The crypt's lock was far more than a simple barrier. It was a crucial part of the ceremony, infused with the essence of the Wainwright bloodline. They needed to prepare for the ritual in the exact manner Jeremiah had outlined. Jack had learned from the journals that the creature's power came not from its physical form, but from the souls it consumed, souls of the dying, caught in the transition between life and death. The ritual was a way to imprison the entity, to keep it contained as it feasted on the soul of its last sacrifice. The creature's essence was absorbed by the crypt's intricate lock, forever sealing it in place. But as Janet and Jack grew closer to completing the ritual, strange things began to happen. At first, it was subtle. Janet had always been frail, her health compromised by her age and the cancer that was slowly consuming her. But in the days leading up to the ritual, Jack began to notice how quickly she was deteriorating. It started with fatigue. extreme tiredness that kept her bedridden for hours at a time. Her pale skin grew even paler, almost translucent, and her once steady hands began to tremble. She would cough uncontrollably as though every breath was a struggle. Jack tried to keep up with her, offering to help, but Janet insisted that she could manage. She knew what was coming and she needed to prepare herself. One night, as Jack worked by the flickering candlelight, trying to prepare the necessary symbols and incantations, Janet suddenly collapsed in the middle of the room. Her breathing became erratic, shallow gasps filling the silence of the crypt. Jack rushed to her side, panic flooding his chest. "Janet, what's happening?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. She looked up at him with a weak smile, her eyes clouded with exhaustion. "It's happening, Jack," she whispered. "The curse, it's taking its toll. My body can't hold out much longer, but it's part of it, don't you see? The creature's influence is already beginning to eat away at me. My time is almost up." Jack's heart pounded as he helped her to a chair, his mind racing. He had known this was coming. He had known that the ritual would hasten the process, but seeing her so weak, so fragile, it made the reality of the situation all the more terrifying. Janet was running out of time. If they didn't perform the ritual soon, she might not survive long enough to complete it. He knelt beside her, gripping her hand tightly. "We can't waste time," he said urgently. "We need to finish this. You're the key, Janet. Your death will end it all." She nodded faintly, a weary smile tugging at the corners of her lips. I know, and I'm ready. But Jack, don't forget. What we're doing here isn't just for me. It's for everyone. You have to keep the seal intact. You can't let anyone break it. Not now, not ever." As Jack and Janet continued their preparations, things grew even stranger. Jack began to experience vivid visions late at night, dreams that felt too real to be mere dreams. He would wake up in a cold sweat, disoriented, with the sound of whispers lingering in his ears. He saw things, strange, shadowy figures moving through the crypt, just beyond his vision, always just out of reach. One night, as he sat alone in the crypt's main chamber, he heard a faint scraping sound behind him, like the drag of nails on stone. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the cold, empty crypt. But the feeling of being watched lingered, and the shadows seemed to stretch and bend in ways they shouldn't. He couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. It wasn't just Janet's rapid decline. It was the crypt itself, the ancient stone and iron, the walls that seemed to pulse with a strange, unnatural energy. The creature was stirring. Jack could feel it. He returned to the journal, flipping through the pages with desperation. He needed to understand, needed to know what was coming. The closer they got to the final ritual, the stronger the visions became. He could feel the creature's presence as though it were waking up, hungry for its release. But as Janet grew weaker, Jack realized something else. He was no longer just a bystander in this cursed family legacy. He was tied to it, bound by the same bloodline that had made the Wainwrights the keepers of the crypt. The creature wasn't just after Janet, it was after him too. And he couldn't shake the feeling that his own fate was tied to hers. The days had blurred together. Time, once something Jack had taken for granted, now felt like a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed on his chest. The clock was ticking. Every passing second brought Janet closer to the final sacrifice, and with her health rapidly deteriorating, Jack could feel the urgency tightening its grip on him. Her breaths had grown more shallow, and each cough racked her fragile frame with violence. It was the night before the ritual, the final night, and Jack couldn't escape the feeling that something was amiss. The creature, The one they had been trying to keep contained for generations was growing restless. Jack could feel it in his bones, in the air that seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, as though something was stirring beneath the earth, waiting to break free. Janet sat in a chair by the crypt, her hands resting in her lap, pale and trembling. Despite her weakness, she had insisted on staying by the crypt, wanting to be close when the ritual finally took place. Jack paced around her, running his fingers through his hair in frustration. "I can't let you do this," Jack said, his voice tight with worry. He looked at her with desperation, trying to make her understand. "There has to be another way. We can't just go through with this." Janet lifted her head slowly, her eyes clouded but still holding a spark of something fierce. She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You don't understand, Jack," she said softly. "This isn't just about me, it's about everyone. You've seen the way things are changing. The creature, it's waking up. If I don't finish this, it will destroy everything. It will feast on the souls of everyone in Hollow Creek. It won't stop until it's free." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. "But your death, Janet, it's too much. I can't just stand here and watch you fade away like this." She reached out weakly, placing her hand on his. "This has always been the way, Jack. My death completes the seal. If I don't do it, the creature will be free and all the lives we've protected. They'll be in danger. I won't let that happen." Jack closed his eyes, trying to ignore the tightness in his throat. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had known this moment was coming. The moment when Janet would have to make the ultimate sacrifice. But now, standing here with her life slipping away so quickly, it felt unbearable. He took a step back, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "I don't know if I can do this," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I didn't sign up for any of this, Janet. I was just a guard, a nobody, protecting an old cemetery. I didn't know it was all leading to this." Janet's eyes softened as she looked at him, her frail hand resting on the edge of the crypt. "We all have a role to play, Jack. You were chosen to protect it just as my family was chosen to keep the creature sealed. This isn't just a job. This is our legacy. And now it's your turn to make sure the seal stays intact after I'm gone." Jack's heart sank as he looked at the crypt. The enormous iron gates, the intricate lock that had been replaced, the crypt itself, everything about this place now felt like a trap. He was just a small part of a centuries-old ritual, and he couldn't help but feel powerless against it. "But what if I fail?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I can't keep the seal intact once you're gone? What if—" "You won't fail," Janet interrupted softly. "You're not alone in this. I've spent my life protecting this place, Jack, and now I'm entrusting it to you. You have the strength to finish what we started." The tension in the air seemed to grow heavier as the minutes ticked by. Jack stared at the crypt's entrance, his mind racing. The ritual had to be completed tonight or the creature would be free. But as much as Janet was ready to fulfill her part, Jack wasn't sure he could bear to see her slip away. As the night dragged on, strange things began to happen around the cemetery. The wind grew stronger, swirling around them in eerie gusts, as if the very atmosphere was charged with tension. Jack could hear faint noises in the distance, scraping sounds like claws against stone echoing through the night. The earth beneath his feet seemed to hum, a low, rhythmic vibration that unsettled him to his core. Janet's breathing became more erratic, each breath a struggle, as if the weight of the world was pressing on her chest. Jack knelt beside her, his heart heavy with the knowledge that time was running out. "Just a little longer," Janet whispered, barely able to lift her head. "We can do this. We have to." The wind picked up again, howling through the cemetery like a living thing, and Jack felt his skin prickle with an ominous sense of foreboding. The creature was waking, just as Janet had said. Jack could feel it, its hunger, its need to be freed, its growing power. It was no longer a distant threat. It was right there, just beyond the veil of the crypt, waiting to be released. Jack glanced at the crypt, then back at Janet. He couldn't keep putting this off. The ritual had to begin. Janet's time was running out and the creature was waiting. They had no more time to waste. He stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess. Everything about tonight felt wrong, as if the very air was heavy with the weight of the past and the future. He had no choice now. The ritual had to be completed. Janet's death would seal the creature away, but only if everything was done precisely as it had been outlined. The final moments were a blur. Jack helped Janet to her feet, her body trembling with each step. She was fading. He could see it in the dullness of her eyes, in the way her skin seemed to grow even paler with each passing moment. But she was determined, and Jack couldn't turn away now. Not when the fate of the town, and perhaps the world, was in his hands. They stood before the crypt, ready to begin the ritual. Jack repeated the incantations from the journals, his voice hoarse as he chanted the ancient words that would secure the seal. Janet, her breath growing more shallow, held a small vial of her own blood, her hand trembling as she passed it to Jack. "Take it," she said, her voice barely audible. "Seal it. The creature's hunger must be stopped." Jack took the vial, his hands shaking as he opened it. With trembling fingers, he smeared the blood across the lock, just as Jeremiah had described in the journals. The blood, the symbols, the incantations, all of it came together as one, a final act of desperation and sacrifice. The crypt seemed to groan as if the earth itself was protesting. The lock began to glow, faint blue light seeping from the cracks in the metal, casting eerie shadows across the cemetery. Janet's hand tightened in Jack's, and for a moment he thought he saw a fleeting smile on her lips, weak but genuine. She had completed her part. She had sealed the creature away. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Midnight struck with an eerie clarity, the soft chime of a distant clock ringing out through the cemetery. Jack stood beside Janet, his heart hammering in his chest as the weight of what was about to happen settled over him. The air around them felt unnaturally still, as if the entire cemetery had paused, holding its breath in anticipation. The ancient Wainwright crypt loomed before them, its dark stone facade bathed in the cold light of the moon. Janet's breath came in short, labored gasps, each one more strained than the last. Her frail body had withered over the past few days, her strength now reduced to mere flickers of energy. Yet her eyes were clear, filled with determination and purpose. "Are you ready?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper, afraid that even his words might disturb the fragile stillness around them. Janet nodded, her grip on the ancient key firm despite the tremble in her hands. The key was heavy, made of brass and iron, and it seemed to hum with a strange energy, as if it were alive. She stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, until she stood before the iron gates of the crypt. Her fingers, pale and delicate, closed around the cold metal of the key. "It's time," she murmured, almost to herself. Then, with a final glance at Jack, she placed the key into the lock. The instant the key turned, a low, groaning sound echoed through the cemetery, as if the crypt itself was waking up from a long, deep slumber. Jack's skin prickled with a sense of foreboding, and a deep shudder ran through him. The gate creaked slowly, agonizingly, as it began to open. The air around them grew colder, much colder, and a faint chill crept down Jack's spine. The smell hit him first, a musty, decaying scent that made his stomach twist with revulsion. It wasn't just the smell of old stone and earth. It was the unmistakable odor of rot, as if something had been decaying for centuries, hidden beneath the layers of stone and metal. Jack fought the urge to gag, but his feet felt rooted to the ground as the door inched open. As the crypt door opened further, the air grew colder still, a biting chill that seemed to seep into Jack's bones. The shadows inside the crypt seemed to twist and writhe, as if they were alive, moving on their own accord. For a moment, everything felt wrong, the air too thick, the darkness too deep. Jack could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him, and a sickening sense of dread filled him. He turned to Janet, her frail body hunched with the effort of holding the key in place, her face pale and drenched in sweat. Yet despite the physical toll, there was a quiet resolve in her eyes. "We can't turn back now," she said, her voice weak but steady. "This is the only way." Jack nodded grimly, his heart sinking as the finality of her words settled over him. The crypt was not just a tomb. It was a prison that had held the creature for centuries, a creature that had been fed by the dying souls of the Wainwright family. And now, Janet's death would complete the ritual, but it would also release the creature once and for all. With a final creak, the crypt doors swung open completely, revealing the darkness within. Jack couldn't see anything beyond the threshold, but the air that rushed out of the crypt was thick and oppressive, carrying with it an unnatural coldness. It was as if the crypt had been holding something back, something vast and terrible that had been waiting for this moment. Janet stepped forward, her footsteps slow and deliberate. She moved past Jack, the ancient key still clutched tightly in her hand. Jack followed close behind, his heart in his throat, his senses heightened. As they entered the crypt, the shadows seemed to shift around them, swirling like a living thing. The crypt was vast, much larger than it had seemed from the outside. Stone shelves lined the walls, each one holding the remains of the Wainwright family members, their names and dates etched into the marble. But there, at the far end of the crypt, was the back wall, smooth, featureless stone that seemed to pulse with a strange energy. It was there, behind that wall, that the creature was kept. Jack's gaze was drawn to the center of the crypt, where a large stone slab lay, covered in dust. The air grew heavier with each step they took, the sense of something pressing down on them almost unbearable. Jack's chest tightened and his breath grew shallow. And then it began. A low, rumbling sound like the growl of an animal too large to be contained echoed from the depths of the crypt. The shadows around them began to shift in earnest, swirling violently, and Jack felt a sudden wave of nausea wash over him. "Stay close," Janet whispered, her voice barely audible. Her body trembled, but her eyes were focused on the stone slab ahead. She knew what was coming, and there was no fear in her gaze, only resolve. As they moved closer, the rumbling grew louder, the shadows intensifying. Jack could feel the temperature drop even further, the air now so cold that it burned his skin. The creature, whatever it was awake. It could sense them. It was hungry. Janet stopped in front of the stone wall, raising her hand, fingers trembling as she traced the symbols that had been carved into the surface, the same symbols they had studied in Jeremiah's journals. She whispered the incantation, the ancient words of binding that had kept the creature at bay for generations. Jack watched her, his heart pounding, as the air around them crackled with a strange energy. Suddenly, the wall trembled. The stone slab shifted, the sound of stone grinding against stone reverberating through the crypt. Jack stepped back, his breath catching in his throat as the stone door began to open, slowly at first, then with a violent jerk. From the darkness within the crypt, something began to emerge, a formless, shadowy figure that seemed to absorb all light around it, making the space darker still. It was massive, its presence overwhelming, as if it were made of the very darkness itself. No shape, no form, just a writhing mass of shadows, stretching and shifting, sucking the life from the very air. And then it spoke, not with words but with a voice that was felt rather than heard, deep and hollow, like the echoes of a long-forgotten abyss. "You have released me." The words were not spoken in a language Jack could understand, but he felt them vibrate in his chest, in his bones. The air was thick with its power, and the very ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse with its hunger. Janet stepped forward, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. "This is the end," she whispered. "It's time." The creature lunged, but before Jack could move, the crypt doors slammed shut, cutting off its escape. For a moment, the world was still. And then, in the silence, Jack heard the sound of breathing. Deep, slow, deliberate breathing from behind the stone wall. The creature, now trapped, would remain confined, but only for a time. Janet collapsed to her knees, her body succumbing to the toll of the ritual. Jack rushed to her side, but it was too late. Her eyes fluttered closed, a peaceful expression crossing her face as the last of her life faded away. The air was thick with the suffocating weight of silence as the crypt stone door slammed shut, sealing the creature back inside. Jack's pulse thudded in his ears, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadows in the crypt still moved, swirling like a storm of ink and darkness, each passing second intensifying the sense of something vast, ancient, and hungry waiting just beyond the stone wall. Janet was on her knees, barely conscious, her body still trembling from the exertion of the ritual. Her frail hands rested in her lap, blood staining the ritual markings on her skin. Jack knelt beside her, his heart heavy with the realization that her sacrifice had been made, that the ritual was complete. But the creature was still there, still thrashing and roaring, locked behind the stone door, held by the blood and will of the Wainwright family. And then it spoke. The voice was not a voice at all. It was a presence, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Jack's bones. It filled the space around them, deep and guttural, reverberating like the roar of something enormous, something that was both everywhere and nowhere at once. "You cannot hold me forever," it said, and the words were felt more than heard, crawling into Jack's mind, twisting his thoughts. "You are nothing but mortals, fragile and weak. I have waited too long." Jack's skin crawled. He looked at Janet, but her eyes were closed, her breathing slow and shallow. She was slipping away. The weight of her sacrifice had drained the life from her, and yet the creature's hunger, its presence, was still palpable, still demanding. The creature spoke again, this time more insistent, more malicious. "I feed on the space between life and death," it said, its voice sliding into Jack's mind like a whisper in the dark. "I devour the souls of the dying, their fear, their pain, their fleeting moments between worlds. You think you can trap me, but I am older than time itself. I am the hunger that has always existed." Jack's stomach turned. He could feel it now, its presence pushing against the walls of the crypt, the very air around him thick with its hunger. He could feel the space between them bending, warping, as though the barrier between life and death had already begun to erode. He tried to focus, tried to shake off the oppressive weight of the creature's voice. "No," he muttered, the word escaping his lips almost involuntarily. "You're wrong. The creature laughed, a low, rattling sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the crypt. "You are fools," it sneered. "You think you can stop me with blood and symbols. You cannot escape your nature. Your fear feeds me." Jack's breath quickened as the truth began to settle in. The creature wasn't just a force of hunger, it was a force of manipulation. It thrived on fear, on doubt. It was trying to break them, trying to twist their resolve and make them release it from its prison. And it was working. He felt the creature's power, its darkness, creeping into his thoughts. For a moment he wavered, his mind clouded with images of failure, of the creature being released to wreak havoc on the world. He felt the suffocating weight of his fear, the terror that had taken root in his chest, gnawing at his resolve. But then he remembered Janet. He remembered the sacrifice she had made, the trust she had placed in him to see it through. She had known what needed to be done. She had sacrificed everything to keep this creature contained. Jack's resolve began to harden, and a fire, long buried beneath layers of doubt and fear, flared within him. The creature could sense his fear, could feed on it. But Jack refused to let it take him. He wouldn't let it take Janet's sacrifice either. He clenched his fists, drawing in a shaky breath. "You think you can break me?" Jack growled, his voice low but steady. "I'm not afraid of you." The creature's presence pulsed with sudden fury. "You are nothing," it hissed, the words venomous and sharp. "You are insignificant, a speck in time. Your resolve is nothing against me." Jack's eyes flickered to Janet's pale face. She was barely conscious, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. She had already completed her part. Now it was his turn. Jack stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him, but his resolve firm. He stepped toward the stone wall where the creature's voice seemed to emanate from, and he reached out, placing his hand flat against the cold stone. The symbols carved into the wall, the intricate patterns they had studied in the journals, glowed faintly in the dim light. Jack could feel the energy pulsing from them, ancient, potent. He closed his eyes, pushing away the fear that still gnawed at him. Janet had done her part, now it was his. He would not let her death be in vain. He would not allow the creature to escape, no matter the cost. "You cannot fight me, mortal," the creature hissed, the sound growing louder in his mind. "I am eternal." Jack steadied his breath, his hand still pressed to the stone. "No," he said, louder this time. "You may be eternal, but you are trapped. You will stay trapped." As he spoke, Jack felt the weight of the ritual shift. The words he had spoken, the incantations from the journal, began to flow from his lips without thinking, without hesitation. The symbols on the wall seemed to pulse in response, glowing brighter as he invoked them. The air around him seemed to crackle, the temperature plunging even further, the shadows growing darker, stretching toward him like reaching fingers. The creature screamed, an inhuman guttural cry that shook the very walls of the crypt. "No," it roared. "You cannot do this. I am the hunger. I am the darkness that fills the void." Jack's hands trembled as he pressed harder against the stone. He felt the weight of his ancestors' bloodline pushing him forward, the will of the Wainwrights anchoring him to the ritual. Janet's death would not be in vain. The creature would not break free. He would see it sealed, no matter what it took. The crypt trembled, the very ground beneath his feet vibrating as the creature struggled against the seal. But Jack held firm, focusing on the symbols, on the power that was flowing through him. He could feel the creature's presence fading, its influence slipping away, its power waning as the seal strengthened. And then, with a final, ear-piercing scream, the crypt fell silent. Jack opened his eyes, breathless, his heart still pounding. The creature was gone. The crypt was still. The oppressive darkness that had filled the air was gone, replaced by a heavy stillness like the calm after a storm. Janet's hand slipped from Jack's, her body still and lifeless, but her face was peaceful. She had done it. She had sealed the creature away, and her sacrifice had ensured that it would never break free. Jack collapsed to his knees beside her, the weight of what had just transpired settling over him. The creature was trapped. The seal was intact. The world was safe for now. The air inside the crypt was still, suffocating in its heaviness. Jack sat beside Janet, his mind in a haze, his body numb with a mixture of dread and sorrow. The weight of everything that had happened, everything that was about to happen, was almost too much to bear. Janet, frail and weakened from days of suffering, had made her decision. The time had come. In her hand, she held the small vial of poison, the last piece of the ritual that would complete the seal. It was not just poison. It was the final, irreversible act that would ensure the creature would remain trapped for eternity. The poison was meant to hasten her death, to allow the ritual to be fulfilled, and to sever the connection between the living world and the horrific entity that had been sealed away for so long. "Are you sure about this?" Jack asked, his voice raw, barely above a whisper. His heart felt like it was being squeezed by an invisible hand. The thought of losing Janet, of watching her slip away in front of him, was unbearable. Yet he knew she had already made up her mind. Janet's gaze was distant, but there was a strength in her eyes that Jack couldn't deny. Despite the weakness that had overtaken her body, despite the toll the illness had taken, there was still a fire within her, a resolve that shone brighter than any fear. She had been carrying this burden for her entire life, and now it was her time to finish it. "This is the only way, Jack," she said, her voice fragile but resolute. "My family has been guarding this crypt for generations, and now it's my turn to make the ultimate sacrifice. If I don't do this, if I don't complete the ritual, the creature will be free. It will destroy everything." Jack's throat tightened as he watched her raise the vial to her lips. His hand reached out instinctively, wanting to stop her, to beg her to reconsider. But he knew there was no turning back now. She had already chosen. This was her fate, and she wasn't doing this for herself. She was doing it for everyone. The vial was small, but it contained enough of the poison to kill her within moments. It was the same poison Jeremiah Wainwright had used to seal the creature in the first place, a poison designed to kill slowly, to keep the victim in a state of limbo between life and death long enough for the ritual to take effect. It was a cruel irony that Janet, the last of her bloodline, had to drink it to finish what her ancestors had started. She smiled weakly, her lips trembling as she spoke one last time. "This is how it ends, Jack," she said softly, her voice a gentle whisper. "But it's not the end of everything. It's the beginning of the end for the creature. The seal will be complete, and it will never hurt anyone again." Jack could barely speak. His heart ached for her, aching for the woman who had sacrificed everything to keep the world safe. She had never asked for this. She had never asked to be the final guardian of the Wainwright legacy. And yet here she was, ready to give everything to save them all. As she tipped the vial to her lips, Jack's hand clutched her own, the warmth of her skin still there, despite the coldness creeping into her fingers. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. How could he say goodbye to someone who had become both his burden and his salvation? With a final breath, Janet drank the poison. Jack could see it almost immediately. Her body stiffened as the poison began its work, the life slowly draining from her, her face turning pale, her one strong hand trembling uncontrollably. The crypt seemed to grow colder, the shadows inside stretching deeper, darker, as if the very stone walls could feel the shift in the air. Jack held her tightly, his own chest tight with grief, as she fought to take in shallow breaths. Each one was weaker than the last, a painful reminder of what she had just done. "Janet," Jack whispered, his voice shaking with emotion, "please stay with me. Don't go, I can't lose you, not like this." Her eyes fluttered open, the light within them dimming as the poison spread through her veins. She gave him a weak smile, her lips barely moving. "I've already given everything, Jack," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "My life, my family, everything has led to this moment. And you've always been the one who could stop it. You'll protect the crypt. You'll protect them." The words were faint, but they echoed in Jack's mind as he held her close, his hands trembling. She was slipping away, and he could do nothing to stop it. Janet's breathing grew more labored, each inhale a struggle, and Jack could feel the life draining from her, bit by bit. Her skin, once warm, was now ice-cold to the touch. Her heart, once steady, was now racing, each beat growing weaker. "Stay with me," Jack repeated, his voice breaking. But he knew deep down that there was no staying. Janet had made her choice. She had completed the ritual. Her death would seal the creature away forever, and her sacrifice would protect the world from the terror that had been locked away for centuries. As her body went limp in his arms, Jack felt the weight of the world shift. He felt the seal locking in place, the creature's power being held back by the strength of Janet's sacrifice. The air grew still, the oppressive tension lifting just a little, as if the world had exhaled a breath it had been holding for far too long. Her hand slipped from his, and Jack gently laid her down on the cold stone floor of the crypt. He looked at her face, peaceful now, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of a smile, almost as if she were content with her final act. The final sacrifice had been made. Jack swallowed hard, trying to push the grief and loss aside, but it was too much. His chest felt tight, and the tears that had been held at bay for so long now threatened to break free. "You did it," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "You saved us, you saved them." The crypt was silent now. The creature was contained and the seal was complete. But Jack could not bring himself to leave. He knelt by Janet's side, holding her hand one last time, and as the minutes stretched on, he knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. Janet had fulfilled her family's legacy, but now it was up to Jack to protect it, to ensure that the sacrifice was never forgotten. He had inherited her burden, her responsibility, and now the crypt, the creature, and the Wainwright legacy were his to guard. The crypt was silent, the heavy air thick with the echoes of Janet's sacrifice. Jack sat beside her, the reality of what had just transpired settling over him like a heavy weight. He could feel the stillness all around him, the absence of her breath, the lack of movement, the quiet that had once been filled with her voice, her presence. He still held her hand, though it felt colder now, colder than he ever imagined it could. Her skin, once warm and full of life, had taken on an unnatural chill, and her eyes, now closed for the final time, were peaceful. A faint smile lingered on her lips, an expression of quiet contentment that seemed to reassure Jack despite the weight of sorrow in his heart. He wanted to hold her longer, wanted to keep her with him just a little bit longer, but the ritual was not over. The seal had to be completed, and Janet's death had triggered the final phase. Jack could feel it, the energy in the crypt shifting, the very air humming with the force of an ancient power that had been waiting for this moment. The walls of the crypt trembled, a low rumble reverberating through the stone. The sound was deep, ominous, as though the earth itself was responding to the weight of what had just happened. Jack looked up, his breath catching in his throat. The crypt symbols, the ones Janet and he had painstakingly studied, began to glow. At first, it was just a faint light, a glimmer that seemed to breathe with the pulse of something alive. But then, as the seconds passed, the glow intensified, spreading from the symbols along the walls to the floor beneath them. The entire crypt seemed to be alive with energy, as if the very foundation of the structure was reacting to the bloodline's final sacrifice. Jack's heart raced. This was it, the final sealing of the creature, the trap that would imprison it forever. The creature, still trapped in the farthest corner of the crypt, began to struggle. Jack could feel its power, its hunger, seeping through the stone, pushing against the walls of its prison. The air grew heavy again, as if the creature's anger was tangible, as if it could reach out and tear through the seal at any moment. The shadows in the crypt writhed, twisting and contorting as though they were alive, trying to escape the bonds that had held them for so long. "Stay contained," Jack whispered through clenched teeth, his voice full of desperation. He could feel the creature's presence pushing against him, clawing at his resolve, trying to make him falter. But he had to remain strong, for Janet, for everyone. The walls of the crypt groaned under the creature's efforts, the pressure building as the creature fought against the ritual. But Janet's bloodline, her final sacrifice, was the anchor that would hold it back. Jack could feel it, her power, her essence, woven into the very fabric of the ritual. Her death had sealed it. The glowing symbols began to pulse in rhythm with the tremors in the ground, as if the crypt itself was being fortified by the energy of the ritual. And then, with a deafening roar, the creature screamed, a sound that was not of this world, a cry that shook the very foundations of the crypt. It was the last attempt, the final thrash of desperation, but it was futile. The ritual was complete. The seal had been set in place. The creature's presence seemed to recede, pulled back into the darkness, into the very stone of the crypt. The shadows no longer writhed. The oppressive weight that had filled the air lifted, leaving a profound silence in its wake. The crypt fell still, completely still. The creature was sealed away, once again trapped in its prison, never to escape. Jack felt the last of its power drain away, leaving only the emptiness in its wake. It was over. But as the creature's presence faded, another transformation took place. Janet's body, still lying peacefully in front of him, began to change. The once lifeless skin that had grown cold with death began to shimmer, her form becoming translucent, as though her very essence was slipping away into the ether. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he watched, unable to do anything but stare, frozen by the bittersweet beauty of the moment. Janet had completed the ritual. Her final sacrifice had sealed the creature, but now she too was being taken by the ritual's power. She was fading, her body dissolving into the very light that had been used to trap the creature. She was becoming part of the seal, part of the energy that would keep the crypt locked forever. Jack reached out, his hand trembling, but she was already slipping away. Her form became more and more transparent until, with one final breath, she was no more. Her body had vanished, leaving nothing behind but the faintest shimmer of light, like a memory fading into the air. The silence that followed was deafening. Jack sat in the stillness, staring at the empty space where she had been. He could still feel her presence, still feel the warmth of her final words, her final moments, but she was gone and the world was safe. The creature was sealed. The town was safe. Jack closed his eyes, his heart heavy with the weight of her sacrifice. She had given everything, and now the burden was his. He had inherited the responsibility of the Wainwright family. He would guard the crypt, guard the seal, and make sure that the creature never broke free again. Janet's sacrifice had ensured the safety of the world, but it had also tied him to the legacy of the Wainwrights, a legacy that would never fade. As he stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him, Jack looked at the crypt one last time. The stone doors were sealed tight. The creature was trapped. The crypt was now a place of peace, its terrible secret locked away forever. And Jack, the last of the Wainwright line, was now its protector. The cemetery was quiet again. The moon, full and radiant, hung high in the sky, casting its soft light over the rows of gravestones that marked the final resting places of the forgotten. The wind had died down, leaving only the sound of the occasional rustling leaf as Jack stood alone in the cemetery, his eyes fixed on the Wainwright crypt. The iron gates were silent now, their usual groan absent as they stood closed, sealed for eternity. The weight of the ritual had lifted, and the oppressive darkness that had haunted the crypt for so long had finally dissipated. The creature was no longer a threat. It was gone. Jack couldn't remember how long he had stood there, staring at the crypt, lost in the stillness. The night felt different now, quieter, as though the world itself had exhaled a long-held breath. For the first time in years, Hollow Creek Cemetery seemed at peace. The creature, the entity that had lurked in the shadows for centuries, was sealed away forever, its hunger stilled. And Janet's sacrifice had completed the ritual, ensuring that no one would ever have to face the horrors it had brought. Jack exhaled deeply, his chest tight with a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. The events of the past few days seemed like a distant dream now, fragments of a nightmare that had become his reality. He had seen death in its purest form. He had witnessed a family curse unfold before him, and he had felt the true cost of protecting something so dangerous. He still couldn't shake the image of Janet's fading form, disappearing into the ritual's energy, her sacrifice completing the seal. He could still hear her voice in his mind, a whisper in the quiet of the crypt, urging him to finish what she had started. And he had done it. But at what cost? Jack's gaze drifted to the horizon, the first light of dawn just beginning to break over the hills. The cemetery was peaceful now, but inside he felt a turmoil he couldn't explain. The weight of what he had witnessed, the terror, the sacrifice, the loss still lingered in his chest. Janet was gone, and with her the final chapter of the Wainwright family's tragic history had been written. She had given everything for the greater good, and Jack, now the last of the Wainwright line, was left with the legacy of their curse. Days passed in a blur after the ritual. Jack continued his work, though everything had changed. Mrs. Wainwright had paid him a visit shortly after the seal was completed. The town, she said, had been informed of the crypt's sealing, and the rumors of the creature's existence had been put to rest. No one would ever know the true story behind the Wainwright family's curse. It would remain a secret, a legacy that would die with Jack. And with that came his reward. Mrs. Wainwright had arranged for Jack to receive a large payout, a sum far beyond anything he had ever imagined. It was meant to be his compensation for the role he had played in sealing the creature and protecting the crypt. It was a substantial amount of money, more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. Jack had taken the check, but the weight of the money felt hollow in his hands. No amount of money could undo the emotional toll the events had taken on him. No sum could replace the life Janet had given, the sacrifice she had made to protect everyone, including him. The financial reward was a mere fraction of the price that had been paid. The payout would secure his future, but it would never erase the memories of what he had witnessed. The screams of the creature, the fading light in Janet's eyes, the feeling of the ancient ritual wrapping around him like chains, those were the things that would stay with him forever. Jack had always thought of himself as a simple man, a night guard, someone who did his job and went home. The cemetery had been his world for years, and he had never questioned the routine. But that routine had been shattered. He wasn't just a guard anymore. He was the last of the Wainwright bloodline, the last protector of the crypt, and the keeper of a terrible secret. He had inherited the legacy of the Wainwrights, but it came with a burden, a responsibility that no amount of money could ever ease. As he walked the cemetery grounds now, he felt the weight of it on his shoulders. The peace that had returned to the cemetery was fragile, delicate. The creature had been sealed away, but the knowledge of its existence, the knowledge of what lay beneath the crypt, would never leave him. He couldn't forget. He couldn't unsee what he had witnessed. The memory of Janet, of her sacrifice, of the creature, would haunt him for the rest of his life. And as the sun began to rise over the cemetery, Jack knew that his life would never be the same. He was no longer just the night guard. He was the keeper of the Wainwright legacy, the last man standing between the world and the terrible secret that lay beneath the stone walls of the crypt. The townspeople would never know what had really happened, would never understand the true price that had been paid to protect them. The Wainwrights had given everything to trap the creature, and now the final chapter of their story had been written. But for Jack, the story was far from over. The crypt was sealed, but his journey had just begun. As he walked away from the Wainwright crypt, the first rays of sunlight illuminating the tombstones around him, Jack felt something stir within him, a sense of duty, a sense of legacy, but also a deep, unshakable sorrow. The creature was gone, the crypt was sealed, and peace had been restored. But the cost of that peace was something Jack would carry with him for the rest of his life. And he would never forget the woman who had given everything to protect them all. The first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, casting a pale, golden glow across Hollow Creek Cemetery. Jack stood at the edge of the cemetery gates, his hands resting on the wrought iron bars. The wind was still, the air fresh with the promise of a new day, yet the heaviness of the past few weeks weighed on him, an unshakable presence in the back of his mind. The crypt, now sealed forever, stood behind him, quiet and undisturbed. The ritual had been completed. Janet was gone. The creature was imprisoned. The world, for the time being, was safe. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that his connection to this place, this cursed land, would never truly end. He had made the decision. It wasn't easy. It wasn't a decision he made lightly. But it was a decision he knew he had to make. Jack had to leave Hollow Creek. He had to move on. The memories of that night, of Janet's sacrifice, of the creature, of the ritual, had become too much to carry. The cemetery, once a place of quiet routine, had become a reminder of everything that had happened, everything he had lost. He took one last look at the crypt. The shadows of the night still clung to its walls, but the oppressive presence that had once filled the air was gone. It was just a tomb now, nothing more, nothing less. With a deep breath, Jack turned away, his mind already focused on the future. He had made his arrangements in secret, contacted a real estate agent, and prepared to leave the town that had defined his life for so long. It was time for a fresh start, for a new path, one that didn't involve the legacy of the Wainwrights or the weight of a family curse. It wasn't long before Jack packed up his things, what little he had left of his old life, and drove out of Hollow Creek. The small town that had once been a quiet haven for him now felt like a prison. He couldn't stay, not after everything he had witnessed, not after everything he had done. The memories of the crypt, the ritual, and Janet's final moments were still too raw. He had to leave. He had to find somewhere far enough away to bury the past. His new town was small, nestled in a quiet valley far from Hollow Creek. It wasn't much, just a handful of shops, a quiet park, and an old diner that looked like it had been there for decades. But it was peaceful. It was a place where people went about their lives, without the weight of ancient curses hanging over their heads. Jack rented a modest apartment, found work at a local hardware store, and tried to settle into a life that felt ordinary, something he had been craving for so long. But the memories followed him. No matter how hard he tried, the ghosts of Hollow Creek haunted him in the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts. The faces of the Wainwrights, the sound of the creature's voice, the fading light in Janet's eyes, they lingered at the edges of his mind. Jack could never truly escape what had happened. It had been a part of him for so long, and now it was etched into his very soul. The memories of that night, of Janet's sacrifice, of the creature's struggle, would follow him for the rest of his life. But maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't consume him the way they had before. He could live with them. He had to. As the days passed, Jack found himself reflecting more and more on the nature of life and death, on the sacrifices people made to protect others from the unknown. He thought about Janet, the last of the Wainwright line, who had given everything to trap the creature, to save the world from something far darker than most could even imagine. Her death had been the final piece of the ritual, but it had come at a terrible cost. In the quiet of his new life, Jack often wondered about the nature of sacrifice. What made someone willing to give everything, even their life, to protect others? What drove Janet to continue the family legacy, to keep the creature sealed away, knowing that her own death would be the price? It was a question Jack couldn't quite answer, but one that lingered in his heart. He realized, too, that there was a certain kind of nobility in the sacrifices people made for the greater good. Janet had sacrificed her life to ensure the safety of others, to make sure the world would never have to face the horrors that had been locked away in that crypt. But there was also a personal cost to that sacrifice, a loneliness, a quiet resignation, and a pain that never quite left. Jack's thoughts often drifted to the Wainwrights, those who had come before Janet, those who had also given their lives to keep the creature contained. Their legacy had been built on sacrifice, and it was one that Jack had inherited, whether he wanted it or not. But now the curse had been lifted. The creature was sealed, and the Wainwright bloodline was no longer bound by the horrors of the past. Janet's sacrifice had ensured that. Still, Jack couldn't help but wonder who would sacrifice for them now. Who would protect the unknown, the things that lurked in the shadows waiting to break free? The weight of that responsibility, now resting on his shoulders, was heavy. But he had learned that sometimes the greatest sacrifices were made without recognition, without reward. People gave everything, not because they expected something in return, but because it was the right thing to do. Jack didn't know what the future held for him. He didn't know if he would ever truly escape the memories of Hollow Creek. But as he stood on the porch of his new apartment, watching the sun set behind the distant hills, he made peace with the life he had chosen. The creature was gone. The crypt was sealed. Janet's sacrifice had completed the ritual. And now Jack had a new path to walk, a path away from the darkness of the past and into the quiet, uncertain future. It wasn't a life without pain, but it was his life. And in that there was some comfort. As the night stretched on, Jack sat by his window looking out at the darkened town below. The past, with all its secrets, had been buried. Hollow Creek, the crypt, the creature, all of it was behind him now. And though he would never forget what he had done, what he had witnessed, he had made peace with it. He had to. Life and death, sacrifice and survival, it was all part of the same cycle. People made sacrifices to protect others, to guard the world from things it couldn't even understand. And Jack, despite the weight of the legacy he carried, would continue the cycle in his own way, in his own time. As he closed his eyes, the soft sounds of the night filling the room, Jack knew one thing for certain. Whatever the future held, he was ready to face it. The past was gone, and now it was time to live. It had been months since Jack had left Hollow Creek, since he had walked away from the crypt and the haunting memories that had come with it. He had started a new life in a new town where the days were quiet, the nights peaceful, and the weight of the past seemed a distant shadow. Yet despite the calm of his new life, something had been gnawing at him, a sense of unfinished business, a call he couldn't ignore. So one morning, without much thought, Jack packed his bags, started his truck, and drove back to Hollow Creek. The town was the same, small, quiet, tucked away from the bustling world. The roads were empty, the shops closed, and the cemetery stood just as it had before, nestled on the outskirts of town, untouched by time. But for Jack, it was no longer just a place. It was the site of everything he had once known, everything he had lost, and everything he had gained. Jack stood at the entrance to the cemetery, the old gates creaking in the wind, as if acknowledging his return. His heart tightened as his gaze shifted toward the Wainwright crypt, its dark silhouette standing proudly in the distance. The shadows no longer felt oppressive, but the memories still lingered, clinging to the stone, to the very air. He walked slowly, his footsteps steady as he made his way through the rows of gravestones, each one a quiet testament to the lives that had passed. The place was peaceful, undisturbed by the horrors that had once threatened it. The silence, now a calm that Jack had come to appreciate, was only broken by the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of the wind through the trees. When he reached the crypt, Jack paused. The seal was intact. The lock remained unbroken. The creature that had once filled these halls with its hunger was still trapped, its presence sealed by the sacrifice of a family and the final act of a woman who had given everything. Jack stood there for a long moment, reflecting on the weight of the ritual, the toll it had taken on everyone involved. He thought of Janet, her sacrifice, the way she had completed what her ancestors had started. And then, with a quiet resolve, he walked to the far side of the cemetery, to a quiet corner he knew all too well. There, he had made arrangements for something he knew would be necessary, a final tribute to the woman who had given everything to ensure the creature would never escape again. At the foot of a tall, ancient oak tree, a new grave marker had been placed. It was simple, understated, but it spoke volumes. Janet Wainwright, it read, beloved protector, last of her line. Jack stood before the marker, his hands resting at his sides, his thoughts quiet. The wind picked up, swirling around him as if to carry his words into the air. "Rest in peace, Janet," he whispered. "You finished what your family started. You gave everything for us, for all of us." He placed a single white flower at the base of the marker, the petals soft and pure against the cold stone. As he stood there, he couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The crypt, the creature, the legacy, it was all behind him now. Janet's life, her sacrifice, her final act of courage, she would never be forgotten. Her name, carved into the stone, would carry the weight of her family's legacy long after the crypt was sealed and the creature locked away. Jack stood for a long time, the silence around him almost sacred. The sun was setting, casting a soft, golden light over the cemetery. The world seemed to breathe in time with the passing breeze, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt at peace. The creature was gone, the crypt sealed, and the town of Hollow Creek was safe. But he knew better than anyone. There would always be darkness lurking in the corners of the world. There would always be things waiting to be uncovered, secrets buried deep in the earth. No place, no person was ever truly safe from the unknown. The cemetery was peaceful, but the world would never stop turning and time would always move forward. There would always be new threats, new horrors, new things waiting to be discovered. Jack took one last look at the crypt, his gaze lingering on the ancient stone and iron gates. He could feel the weight of the past pressing on him, but it was not a weight he would carry alone anymore. He had done his part. He had sealed the creature, but he knew that others in time would come to stand watch over the crypt. They would guard the gates, unaware of the horrors that had once been contained there. As Jack turned to leave, he thought about the future, about the people who would come after him. Would they understand the importance of their role? Would they know the true history of the crypt? Would they remember the sacrifices that had been made, the lives that had been lost, and the terror that had been kept at bay? In the end, it didn't matter. The legacy would live on. The ritual would be remembered, even if the story faded with time. The crypt would remain sealed, and the creature would never again be free. As Jack walked away from the cemetery, his footsteps lighter than they had been when he arrived, he knew that his journey had come to an end. He had made peace with the past, with the sacrifice of Janet and the Wainwright family, and with the role he had played in protecting the world from the creature. But he also knew that his story wasn't the last one to be told. The cemetery, with its crypt and its dark secrets, would outlast him, just as it had outlasted the generations of the Wainwrights. And in the future, someone else would take his place. Someone would stand guard, unaware of the history beneath their feet, unknowingly protecting the town from the terror that had once been. As Jack reached the end of the cemetery road, the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, and he looked back one final time. He didn't know what the future held, but he had made peace with it. The torch had been passed, and for now that was enough.